This is an experience that happened to me when I was 14 years old, and it's 100% a real incident. This was 2 years back or so, but thinking about it still gives me goosebumps to this day. It was about 10 o'clock at night, and I was on my computer studying. It had been 2 hours, and I was working on a very boring chemistry assignment. So, I decided to take a brief break and started watching some videos to entertain myself. Now, my table that I was working at was a bit far away from my window. The window was on my left, so I could hear anything clearly if someone was outside. As I was sitting there watching my videos, briefly, I thought I could hear a footstep coming from out there. At first, I decided to ignore it, as I thought it must be my imagination, or perhaps a sound that was coming from the video I was watching instead. I decided to close the video now and get back to work. Just as I'd started doing my chemistry assignment once more though, I heard another footstep coming from outside. Well, this couldn't be coming from a video. I ignored this one too, but after a few minutes, I heard a small and clear laugh, and yet more footsteps. This time it was loud, nearby and clear. I was sure it had come from outside my window. I walked over and tried to look outside. I couldn't see anyone out there in the darkness, and it seemed pretty empty. Still though, I decided to tell my father it was freaking me out. I went straight to my father's study and told him. Of course, he didn't believe me. He said I was just being paranoid and misinterpreting sounds from my computer, but I was sure it was not my computer or my phone. I insisted to my father that he go and investigate, even just briefly. With great reluctance, he finally agreed. He grabbed a torch and went outside. After quite a bit of time, he came back in and told me our neighbor was just doing work in his garage, and that must have been the sounds I was hearing. I didn't believe him though. That didn't explain the laugh I'd heard, and it didn't sound like the things I was hearing either. Still though, it seemed to be done now, so I decided to call it a day. I went back and finished up all my work on my computer. It was now around 12 a.m. I decided to finally get some sleep. Surprisingly, I didn't really hear anything else. I was beginning to think it must have been my imagination, perhaps a hallucination from overworking or something. I went to sleep after brushing my teeth. Usually I'm a very heavy sleeper, but for some reason that night I was having a lot of trouble sleeping. Just when I was about to fall into a deep sleep, I was woken up suddenly by a sound. I realized the sound was a laugh, and I could hear footsteps outside my window. My parents were sleeping now, so was my brother, so I decided to investigate myself. My phone told me the time was now 3 o'clock in the morning. Everything was so dark I could barely see anything. Unlike my table, my bed was right next to the window, so all I had to do was look out of it. I took my phone out and switched on the light. Everything seemed to be okay, until I shined it at my window. What I saw gives me goosebumps to this day. Standing outside, with her face pressed against the window, was a woman standing there, her face completely covered in blood. Her eyes were extremely bloodshot as well, and it seemed like her mouth was full of sharp teeth or something. She was standing there laughing. I screamed, and the woman ducked out of sight. My parents came over and asked what was wrong. I told them what happened, but they didn't believe me at all. They told me it was still just my imagination, but I was absolutely sure I had seen her. My father checked outside and didn't find anything. Finally, they managed to convince me to just go asleep and assume it was a bad dream. The next morning, as my cousin and my brother were playing outside though, they discovered a white cloth that had not been there before and a photograph of a woman in front of my window. When they showed it to me, I was extremely scared. It was the very same woman I'd seen that night. I don't know who she was or why she did that, but I never saw her again after either. I'll preface this by saying this is a true story. We were staying in this fancy hotel for my cousin's wedding, and I was around 12 at this time. I woke up very suddenly that morning to a rough shove, assuming it was my sister waking me up. It was early morning, sometime around 7:30 or so. I groggily stepped out of the bed and was immediately hit with hairspray fumes. I could hear the sound of someone taking a shower, as well as loud hurried footsteps and repetitive spritzes of the hairspray can. I walked to the dresser and pulled out a blouse and a skirt. As I got dressed, I heard knocking on my door. I pulled my top fully on and opened it. No one was there. I was kind of freaked out right now, but I knew it must just be my imagination or something. After all, I was still half asleep. I exited the bedroom and heard the shower shut off as I passed by the lavatory. I then heard my father's heavy footsteps at the end of the hall. There was another restroom there. I could hear that same hairspray noise coming from inside, so I called out, "Hey, Mom, if you're in there, I need to pee. Dad's in the other bathroom right now." I heard my mother's voice call back, "Alrighty." It was definitely her voice, but that was not something she would ever reply with. I rolled my eyes though and walked away. I figured I should go wake my granddad, as I heard heavy snores coming from the room that he was sharing with my parents. In fact, I wondered why my parents hadn't woken him up yet. When I opened the door though, I was extremely startled to find that the room was empty. Just then, the noises and smell of hairspray stopped as well. I ran downstairs, only to see that everyone else was already eating breakfast. I checked my watch and saw it was already 10 o'clock. My mom stared at me. "What's wrong?" I started to ask. My sister interrupted me. "What the heck?" I asked them what was wrong. My sister then replied, "Didn't you just go to the bathroom?" She pointed to the lavatory next to the small kitchen area. I walked over there and pressed my ear to the door. Sure enough, I could hear someone was in there, washing their hands. I shook it off at first and counted my fingers. All 10 of them. It seemed I wasn't dreaming. I knocked on the door. Inside the bathroom, I heard a voice calling out, "Alrighty." I looked over at my parents, sister, and granddad, who were all pale. Behind my back, I heard the lock click, followed by what I swear was my own voice saying, "Hey there, Sarah," and footsteps. I turned around just in time to see my own feet, dressed in my black velvet flats, turning the corner on the staircase. At least, that's what it seemed. I felt paralyzed with fear, and goosebumps crept up my back immediately. I wasn't able to move for about a minute before I told my family about what happened a few moments ago. My sister told me that yesterday when she woke up, I wasn't in my bed, but she heard noises coming from the bathroom as well. When she went there, she saw someone that looked like me, walking down the hall in my pajamas. She called out to me, but they just kept walking. Well, when she went back to my room, she could see I was still sound asleep in my bed. She freaked out and didn't tell anyone. Fast forward to 2 years later, my cousin now has a 6-month-old baby, and we're talking to each other over tea. Well, I shared with my cousin that story about what happened to me and my sister, and she immediately froze. "What, you mean that happened to you too?" I felt goosebumps return to my arms and legs. She then told me she had woken up and walked downstairs, only to see someone who looked like her husband sitting at the table eating cereal. He greeted her like normal and then said he was going to get something from upstairs. Well, it was taking him quite some time. Eventually, she felt concerned and went to check on him, only to find he was still fast asleep in his pajamas. This is an incident that happened to my grandfather in the past. It was in the 1970s. Let's call my grandfather Dada. He was around 38 to 40 years old at the time this happened. They used to live in Patna, Bihar. Now, for your information, at that time, during the monsoon season, Patna used to get flooded a lot, and the danger of alligator attacks was also at its highest level. Every night he would go to the library, as he was very much into reading at that time. At the time of the monsoon, though, my Dada's elder brother used to accompany him to the library and back. After all, he didn't want to not go and find out his younger brother had died from an alligator attack or something. One day, they heard the rumor of a woman who practiced witchcraft roaming all around the city naked in the open air, killing humans for fun and dancing on their dead bodies. Apparently, she was a human being and nothing supernatural, but her mental condition was not exactly stable. The ignorant, superstitious people around thought she was a ghost. So, on to the encounter. One night, while returning from the library, he was crossing the mighty Ganga, which had alligators in it. There was no light, and both my Dada and bro were obviously scared from this already. They had crossed the river. They didn't even realize it at the time when a dog arrived and his tail brushed against my Dada's knee. In that moment, he thought it was an alligator, but then he looked down to see he was already on land, safe and fine. Instead, though, when he looked up, he saw something far more frightening. They moved ahead just a bit and looked back to see there was a woman naked in the open air, sitting on the land muttering something to herself, her eyes moving up and down rapidly, and there was now no sign of that dog. The woman turned to face them and smiled. "What's in the bag?" "None of your business." "There are books. I can see. I can see." She repeated this several times over. Then she got to her feet and frog jumped towards them. She jumped 3, 4, 5 times and then was right in front of them. She leaned in and whispered, "Can I kill you?" "What's wrong with you? Go back home!" She started to scream and cry aloud, screaming out home over and over. At this point, my daughter took a stone from the ground and threw it next to her to startle her. She suddenly fainted, and there they ran away as fast as possible. After a few minutes, though, just when they thought they'd arrived in a safe place, she was right in front of them again. She had that stone in her hand now, acting like she was ready to kill them. My grandfather tried to think quick. His brother used to smoke and always carried cigarettes on him. I don't know if any of you know about this, but here there's this thought of narcotics being so intoxicating it makes the person sleepy and gloomy. He asked his brother to take out that patch of cigarettes and lit one, holding it out towards the woman. She threw the stone away and grabbed the cigarette. Then she smoked it for a bit before slowly dozing off, or so it seemed. They started running again. This time they looked back and saw the woman was missing once more, and they couldn't see where she was at all. They ran and never stopped until they arrived back home. The woman was about terrorizing people for some time after. Unfortunately, some days later, he heard the woman had been killed by a wild alligator. It seemed that even in death, her body was smiling. An unfortunate series of occurrences, to be sure. Alright, so a scary situation. I've had a few of those in my life, but right now one thing in particular comes to mind. I was working in a nursing home as a CNA, or Certified Nurse's Aide. Most of the residents there were elderly, but there was one man there who was in his mid-40s or so. He had complications from diabetes, but I don't know if he was there just for some type of rehab or perhaps a permanent resident. What I do know is that he was mean as all get out. All the CNAs were warned to be very wary of him. He had this bad habit of peeing in his trash can and exposing himself to all the female CNAs. Well, of course, I was working on this man's wing. I was going about my rounds when I came over to his room. I took a deep breath and put on this huge smile, then walked inside. He was just sitting there on his bed. I spoke to him in a light-hearted manner, telling him it was such a beautiful day outside. I would come back and take him to the porch later if he'd like me to. The man never said a single word. Instead, he just scowled at me. I managed to convince him to sit down in a chair and got his sheets changed. The room was straightened out as well, and I cautiously took the trash bag from his trash can, which of course was full of piss. I set the dirty linens in the trash bag outside his door, and he went back over to his bed. I went into the restroom to empty that trash as well, when suddenly there he was in the bathroom with me. I was startled. Even though I had thought I was being careful around this guy, he moved faster than lightning. He was very strong for a sick guy as well. Immediately he was on me, grabbing at my clothing. His one arm wrapped firmly around me so I could not escape at all. He wasn't a big guy, but he was very strong. I felt a panic begin to rise in me as I realized he'd now closed his door. His pants were pulled partway down. I was sure something horrible was going to happen to me right now in this bathroom, in this damn cursed nursing home. I don't know how, but somehow I managed to grab the string that hung near the toilet that connected to the emergency light. You see, there's a light above each door. You pull the string in the bathroom and the light would blink red on and off, just in case someone falls down or something. Thank God someone noticed the blinking light and came racing into the room. A male CNA then rushed in. Between the three of us, we managed to get the resident off of me. He had torn my top and ripped off a couple of buttons, but thankfully no other harm was done. I was pretty damn shaken up, and from then on, management required 2 CNAs to be together at all times when doing rounds in his room. I hate to think what would have happened if not for that blinking red light outside his door. I got into this lift car like I had done numerous times before. After the car started moving, I noticed the driver had turned in the wrong direction. I thought maybe he was just going to take an alternate route or something, but very quickly I could see that was not the case. Immediately I spoke up. Excuse me, sir, but I think you're going the wrong way." He replied almost immediately. "Oh, really? I'm sorry, my GPS is just so messed up." He poked around at the smartphone attached to his dashboard, which I now noticed was off. That's when the "oh shit, this is how you die" feeling kicked in. I was sitting in the passenger seat, so I tried to act as calm and discreet as possible. I reached into my bag to make sure my phone and keys were in reach. As nonchalantly as possible, I said, "Oh, that's no problem. Just make a right here and take Main Street back towards Pleasant City." He argued with me briefly, but then turned in the right direction. I sighed with relief. Perhaps the danger had just been in my head. Then he spoke up again.
"You seem like a decent, morally upright young woman, Sammy. Can I ask you for some advice about a problem I'm having?"
I stiffened in my seat immediately but nodded. What else was there to say? He proceeded to tell me about this relative he was worried about, who was involved with prostitution. This bitch needed his help, and all he wanted in the world was to save her, but she refused to tell him her address. What a shocker, I know.
"If only I knew her address. I don't care what she says. I'd go there and kidnap her for her own good."
The driver proceeded to get more and more worked up, cursing and yelling, while exit strategies rushed through my head.
"You know what the problem is? This bitch is possessed by Satan. It's the only explanation. She's not like you. You can tell from looking at a woman whether they're morally upright or not."
He looked meaningfully at me, while I shrunk away. I was glad at least at that moment that there was no sign on my head reading "proud sex worker," which I am. Fixing his gaze directly at me while driving, he posed a question. I felt at that moment my response would determine his next course of action.
"Sammy, is it so wrong for me to want to help this girl? Should I just say fuck it and let someone I love ruin her life? Or should I keep trying, even though she tells me she doesn't want it?" I wanted to tell him he was being a psycho, and it was obvious why she didn't want his help. Instead, though, I said something like, "It's really, really good you care so much about her. That's not wrong, but you can't help someone who doesn't want it, you know? That's not your fault." I don't know if you could tell, but I was now trembling. At this point, he was close to my home. He seemed to calm down, and I got the distinct feeling I'd narrowly avoided disaster. As he pulled up to my place, he looked at me with a deadpan expression. "You're a smart girl, Sammy. Let's think on this advice."
I got the fuck out of that car and went inside, very relieved to be home. I was also cursing myself for using my home address though. For that reason, I was afraid to leave any kind of feedback. I deleted Lyft immediately and never heard from the man ever again. It was August 1st, 2004, at around 2 a.m. or so. I was with a friend and we had been visiting my family. We went to one of those all-night diners to have some coffee and pie afterward. My truck was parked at his house about an hour away, and we were headed back so I could get to it and go home. We were on I-10 in Louisiana, just outside of New Orleans. We noticed that a car was now tailgating us, with their brights on as well. That was quite odd, but neither of us really thought anything of it. We were getting off at the next exit anyway. We left the interstate and pulled onto the highway. That car followed us though, and started to pass on my side, the passenger side. My friend turned left to go to his house. At this point, nothing seemed amiss. When my friend made the turn though, the car immediately whipped in behind him. Well now, that was a little bit strange. Then it pulled up on the driver's side this time and slowed down to match our pace. Immediately, I thought, something's not right here. I leaned over to look at the car and told my friend, "We need to get away, this doesn't look good." My friend was not fast enough. Before the words had fully come out of my mouth, the passenger window slid down and a gun appeared over the top. The man started shooting into our car. My friend pushed me onto the floorboard while he tried to get away. I told him he couldn't outrun the car, not in the tracker, so he slammed on the brakes. The car pulled in front of us at an angle. I peeked over the dash, only to see the man had gotten out and was now walking towards our car, arm extended, shooting and shooting and shooting. My friend got the tracker in reverse and floored it out of there. We flagged down a police officer, and in about 5 minutes the entire place was crawling with police. My friend had been shot twice, once in the arm and once in the side. I had not been hit at all. While I was standing there with my friend as the paramedics tended to him, one of the officers asked me if I was hit. I told him no, but he insisted that I must be. He wanted me to get checked out by EMS because there was no way I could have been missed. I showed him I was fine though, and he brought me over to the car. He showed me the inside of the passenger door. It was full of bullet holes. He even showed me a bullet hole stuck in the back of my seat. There were also holes that went completely through the entire console. He looked at me. "I just want to confirm, you said you were on the floorboard here the entire time." I said, "Yes, sir." "You understand what that means, right? Those bullets would have had to pass through you to end up where they did. It's impossible for them to have missed you. I don't know what happened, but surely your guardian angel was working overtime tonight." He was absolutely right. Why? Why would someone do this? It was one of the scariest times of my life. But I did get some answers as to why this had happened. Why that guy picked us, though, I'll never know. While the guy was shooting, I kept on asking my friend, why is he doing this? He kept on saying, I don't know. I admit, though, now in hindsight, I did think that maybe he had made someone angry or perhaps been involved in something shady. It turned out that wasn't really the case, though. They did catch the guys in the end. There were 7 guys in 2 separate cars. The other group had went to a nearby random apartment complex and shot the entire thing up. The 3 guys in the car that targeted us were apparently headed over there when they saw us and decided we would be easy targets. The detective told me it was a gang initiation for 3 of the guys. Yes, they were all caught, arrested, and prosecuted. They were the only ones shooting, but they had a bunch of loaded guns with them, which explains why the guy who came after us seemed to have an unlimited supply of bullets. During my college days, I was staying in a college hostel. One day after having my dinner, I went to my room to study. I had my internal exam the next day, so I had to make sure I was ready. Our room was a 6-sharing, very spacious room with 2 bathrooms. That day, myself and 2 friends were the only ones there in the room. The other 3 cots were empty. My roommates were asleep by 10 p.m., but I was well awake into the midnight hour studying. I tried to go to sleep as best I could around 1 o'clock or so, but it was hard to really sleep properly in that kind of space. Just when I had begun to fall into a light slumber, something disturbed me. I got up and noticed it was around 2:30 a.m. or so. At first, I thought I had been disturbed by the sound of the fan. I could hear it spinning very slowly and making a lot of noise due to the low voltage. Other than that, there was perfect, total silence. Then, though, I looked over and suddenly realized I was looking at a strange man sitting in the vacant cot of my room. I didn't know who this man was, and I'd never seen him before either. In my groggy state, I suddenly realized, what exactly was a man doing in a ladies-only hostel, and in my room at that? Needless to say, it was an extreme shock, and I began sweating profusely, totally terrified. I could only watch helplessly as I saw the stranger slowly getting up from the cot with a knife clearly visible in his hand. It looked like he was moving over to stab my friend, who was sleeping soundly in the other corner of the room. I tried to open my mouth to speak, but the only things that would come out were frightened squeaks as I tried to wake up my friend who was sleeping next to me. I really wanted someone else to wake up and help me, but my attempts all failed, and all I could do was shiver in place. As I saw the man moving closer to her, I jumped out of my bed suddenly, shouting, "Thief! Thief!" That woke my neighbor up right away. She got frightened and ran over and asked what had happened. I told her there was a thief on the other side of the room with a knife. She was also extremely scared, and we switched on the lights together. Well, nobody was there. We did find my friend sleeping soundly and getting extremely annoyed to be woken up. The other girl asked where he was. I told her he might have been hiding in the restroom or under the cot perhaps. So the 3 of us all searched for him together, but in the end we couldn't find him. I don't know exactly what happened to him. Moreover, the door was still locked from the inside. The very next morning, my roommates had told all about the incident to all of my batchmates, and everybody made fun of me. But to this very day, I still can't exactly figure out what might have happened there. I don't know how he could have possibly escaped or gotten in even if the door was still locked. When everybody cleared the street and the shopkeepers suddenly shuttered up all their stores, well, that should have been a sign that something was really wrong that day in Guatemala City. I had just arrived the day before though, so I wasn't fully aware of political developments in Guatemala since the last time I'd visited. I was waiting for a bus in the downtown Zona 1. As a Peace Corps volunteer in neighboring Honduras, I was used to riding public transportation wherever I went in Central America. After I waited for more than 10 minutes without seeing a single bus pass by, I knew immediately something was wrong. I didn't have a clue as to what was about to unfold, though. It was like the mood on the street had changed in an instant. Everybody rushed to pull down the steel curtains in front of their shops, and a few other pedestrians at the bus stop began to sprint for cover. I heard shouting coming from somewhere in the distance, and a moment later, a mob of more than 100 students appeared before me. They had completely taken over the street, marching and chanting slogans. They looked harmless in their school uniforms, the girls in plaid skirts, and the boys in white shirts and khakis, many of them even carrying book bags. One young man in the front, I thought he must have been an engineering student, was holding a large T-square. They all seemed so excited and pumped up with adrenaline. I thought it must be some kind of rally. Perhaps their team had just won a soccer tournament or something. Then, though, a bus pulled in. The crowd of students surged around the bus, and I thought to myself, well, there goes my ride. The only bus I'd seen all morning, and these kids were going to shove their way on board in front of me. But those students did not want to ride the bus. I watched in amazement as the young man in front hacked out the windows with his T-square. The other students rushed inside and dragged out the driver and passengers. Then they set the bus on fire. It was so bizarre. It felt like I was dreaming. All of a sudden, these kids in their school uniforms were rioting in the street in front of me. For once, I broke down and paid a taxi to get me the hell out of there. I took the cab to Zona 10, the wealthy suburbs of the city, where I had a business meeting to attend. There, everything seemed calm and ordinary. I conducted my business for the next few hours until one of the staff informed us there was some bad trouble downtown. A public transportation rate hike had gone into effect that day, and the students were extremely angry. No one much seemed concerned, but the director of the project requisitioned a car and driver specifically to take me back to my hotel. In the comfortable remove of Zona 10, we all felt safe. No one there had any idea what I'd be returning to in downtown Zona 1. About a mile from the hotel, traffic had stopped completely. What had started as a student bus burning a few hours before had turned into a full-blown, violent, deadly riot. Numerous buildings were on fire. Grown men were looting stores and restaurants to the right and left in front of us. I looked ahead only to see them turning over cars with people still in them and setting them on fire as well. It was just a matter of time before they got to us. My driver could not move the car forwards or backwards at this point. He told me I had to go by foot. There was nothing else he could do. I was on my own from here. I stepped out of the car. The next thing I remember is somehow arriving at the hotel, just as the concierge was nailing the entrance shut with sheets of plywood. Somehow, I had managed to sprint for a mile through the center of the riot without retaining any memory of what happened to me between my departure from the car and arrival at the hotel. I totally blanked out, as in dissociative amnesia. Somehow, I managed to make it through alive. I don't know how I did or what happened on the way. Nothing at all. I do have vivid memories, impressions of a man carrying a cash register out of a fast food chicken place, a driver in front of us screaming and running from his car as rioters threw fire at it, stepping out of the car I was in, arriving at the hotel, the concierge hurriedly ushering me inside, with no other memories in between. I guess instinct alone must have gotten me through that horrible mess, but it wasn't telling me how I did it. That night, I watched from my hotel room terrified as light armor rolled through the streets of the capital city, accompanied by busloads of troops and militia, gun-mounted pickup trucks pouring into town to quell this uprising. The militia in their homemade technicals were the worst, because I knew they were outside the law, with free reign to kill and terrorize anyone they wanted. I was so dissociated through the sheer intensity of these events that I don't think I was actually ever scared. It was like being on a super fake Disney ride or something. Pirates of the Caribbean Central American riot version. The parts I remember at least. The riot wasn't the scariest part though. There are no emotions of any kind associated with that event itself. It's the aftermath that really got to me. All my emotional trauma centers on the violent repression that seemed sure to follow this. The armored cars and technicals arriving on the scene by night to round up, torture, kill, and disappear the opposition. That's what really bothered me. That's the part I really felt once I was safe hidden away in my hotel room. Those were bad times in Central America, and it's still bad, from what I hear. So one day, I ordered a ride-sharing car at almost 12 midnight after partying a bit. I'd gotten a little bit drunk, but not enough to where I couldn't think straight. Immediately as the car pulled up, I noticed it looked quite weird. Its car license number was different from what was written on the app, too. When it arrived, the driver offered me shotgun, the front passenger seat, instead of offering the back. I tried to open the back seat door, only to find it was shut closed. It wouldn't open no matter what I tried. The driver said the back door was broken, so he insisted I sit at the front. My biggest weakness is that I tend to trust people too quickly, which makes me a little bit reckless sometimes. Therefore, I innocently trusted the driver and was about to sit in the front. At that moment though, as I took one step into the car, I noticed the silhouette of a man wearing a mask in the back seat. Well, instantly that set off alarm bells. I sensed that something was not right here, and I almost shit my pants. At that moment, I realized that this driver was at the very least trying to rob me. Speaking of robbery, there was a popular report on the newspaper about passengers of ride-sharing or taxi services getting robbed and killed by these shadow drivers. These shadow drivers would clone a real driver's phone or pretend to be a taxi and intercept orders late at night. The method was the same as what almost happened to me. The passenger would be asked to sit at the front, and someone hiding from behind would smother you until you passed out. They'd usually target young women to be robbed, raped, and killed. Nonetheless, they'd rob anyone who seemed incautious or reckless enough, especially those who looked drunk or in a hurry. Snapping back into the moment, the driver casually asked me, "Well, why are you still standing there? Come on in." I guess in the darkness he didn't realize my pale, almost scared to death face. I replied instantly, "Well, who's that in the back?" I pulled my leg back from the car, pointing to the silhouette of the man in the back seat. It seemed the shadow driver realized his cover had been blown. He shut the door quickly and drove off right away. I've been living in Jakarta for most of my life, and I've never been robbed ever, even from being pickpocketed. That was the closest moment I'd ever come to me being robbed. Now let me start this off by saying I look very young. Common bets usually range from 15 to 18 years old. When I don't put makeup on, several waiters have even handed me the kids menu before. Really, I'm not kidding. On to the point in question though. I've been studying abroad in Florence for a couple of months and had taken a weekend off to visit Naples by myself. It had all been pretty great so far. Nice gelato, a trip to some good museums, lots of good food, and a really nice hotel. That is, until I decided to go visit the Castel dell'Ovo, the castle of the egg, literally. I was taking pictures of the site while still on the jetty, when I noticed a man seemed to be staring at me. Okay, not so big a deal. He was about 5 meters away or so. Almost as if in a cartoon, though. He started to slide towards me very slowly. I kept on taking pictures, trying to ignore it. He finally approached me, though, and started speaking in an incomprehensible Italian. He seemed shy and was talking extremely softly. I walked up to him and craned my neck towards him, because I literally could not hear a single thing he was saying. Again, he seemed very shy, so my wariness decreased a bit. I later understood, though, that he was speaking in that volume on purpose, so I would step even closer. I was hell-bent on going home speaking a somewhat fluent Italian, so I decided I was going to do my best to try and speak with this man. Hindsight is 20/20. Halfway through our conversation, I understood he was talking in the dialect of the region, so our soft exchange of incomprehensible Spanish, English, Italian, French was going nowhere. I still had some stuff to do, so I decided to cut it off there. I mumbled out a goodbye and said I had to go somewhere else. I had an essay to do or something. The man suddenly jerked up immediately, and his whole body language changed in an instant. "How old are you?" This was asked with a whole different tone and in perfect, crystal clear English. He'd gone from this timid Italian man who kept looking away into the sea, hands in pockets, to a guy who was suddenly way taller than me. He was staring at me with such intensity that it made me take a few steps back. Why had I stepped back so fast? I was suddenly very scared. I pointed to a random guy in a red hoodie nearby and said, "Hey, that's my brother. I gotta go catch up with him now." I sprinted away. I was suddenly very conscious of my ponytails, my purple jacket, my face without makeup, and of my height. I must have looked like 14 years old. I was also suddenly conscious of being alone. That hadn't really happened until that point. I rushed into the Castel dell'Ovo and started taking pictures of the place to calm myself down. Relax, there's people here. It's just a weird guy, right? I thought I was safe since I hadn't seen him following, but unbeknownst to me, he had followed me. I really wanted to enjoy my holiday and was reading the signs, walking slowly, taking pictures of the scenery. Nevertheless, I couldn't shake this feeling of uneasiness. Every time I'd heard the phrase before, I felt like I was being watched. I'd always done this same shoulder shrug. It's not like human beings have a sixth sense or whatever, right? We ain't a deer in the wild or something. But this was the first time I realized that this was a true, totally legitimate feeling. I couldn't take a single picture without looking over my shoulder now. I was searching for a face I desperately did not want to find there. I didn't notice him until an hour had passed by, and I was nearly at the top of the castle. I snapped a photo, watched my camera's monitor, turned around, and lo and behold, there he was. He was barely peeking from behind a wall, as if he thought we were in a noir movie or something. He was pretending he was not taking pictures of me. I stared at the man, now obviously caught. He stared back at me. He raised his cell phone once more, and this time snapped a picture fully in view. Then he stepped back into the hallway out of my sight. As cliché as it may be, I instantly felt a cold chill run down my spine. I really wanted to enjoy this sight and this day, but I found myself tripping over my own feet escaping from that castle, half wondering why I was going so fast, and half wondering if he was still there behind me. Sure enough, he was, not even hiding now. He was keeping pace with me. He was seriously just chasing behind me, moving almost like a snake in between other tourists, walking really fast now. I had never felt like a deer before. I'd always thought I would be a rational person, that in a moment of panic would stop, analyze all my options, and devise a perfect plan. I didn't realize how hard that was to do though, until I was so scared I couldn't figure anything out. I was out of the castle and on the streets now, and I couldn't hear a single thought over the sound of my own heart. I remember I kept calling out my mom's name like a broken record, wondering what the hell I should do. I went down a couple of random side streets. I lost track of him and got lost myself like an idiot. I'm the worst at directions. Finally though, I entered a shop and checked Google Maps and found my way back to where I was supposed to go. He must have followed me for a good additional 20 minutes. Add to that the whole hour I'd spent at the castle. Needless to say, I did not stop moving until I reached my hotel once again. I hated it. I hated that I didn't leave the hotel until the next morning. I hated this dizzy feeling in my head, and I hated that I didn't have the courage to tell my boyfriend until months later. It's not like he really could have done anything anyway, he wasn't there with me. But I always go back to that man and his voice asking how old I was. Why was that relevant? And why had he sounded so mad asking about my age? Strangers have kept following me since. After all, I have the bad habit of traveling alone while looking very young. But since then, I've learned to stop and think when some random person approaches me. I remember I was walking down the street in my old neighborhood in Baltimore when all of a sudden I got this really uneasy feeling. I looked up and down the street and could see through to the main street as well. There were lots of alleyways in between though. I looked to the right, then to the left. I couldn't see anything at all to be afraid of, but I was still feeling it. I remember I was about to take a step forward into an alleyway when I swear to you, I heard a voice inside my head saying with complete urgency, "Stop, turn around and go the other way now." So that's what I did. I turned around and sprinted the other way. That night, I remember I kept hearing sirens from police cars all over, and I was really uneasy, double-checking all the door locks, the window locks. I called all of my family to make sure they were all right as well. Everyone was saying they were hearing these sirens all night too, so I knew it wasn't just me. I told my mom I'd had that uneasy feeling coming home that night, and I was still in fact feeling pretty on edge. I told her I'd called the family and everyone seemed fine, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was really wrong. She had heard the sirens too, of course, and told me to just stay inside. She was there with me after all, so she wouldn't let anything bad happen to me. I tried my best to relax. The next morning, my mom and I were watching the news when the reporter was saying there had been a brutal rape and murder on that very same street. In fact, the very same block I'd had such an uneasy feeling on the night before. I lost my mind, and instantly I started tearing up. I started telling my mom that was where I'd felt that feeling. That girl could have easily been me, had I not listened to that voice in my head. My mom started to cry too. It was all a horrible mess. I'm glad I listened to my voice that night, or I wouldn't be here now telling you about this. I guess maybe I noticed something subconsciously that set me off. When I was a kid, Halloween was a fun holiday. No one was putting razor blades in candy or handing out candy-shaped fentanyl yet. We roamed all over town without a tremble amongst us. We were a group of 4, a brother and sister, and me and my sister. I was dressed as a bum, my sister as a baggy-dressed school marm. The other girl was dressed as Robin Hood and her brother as a monk. She was about 10 years old, her brother and I 11, and my sister 8. We just stopped at this big house, and I realized there was a grown-up party going on. They were all laughing and talking, but I noticed that all of them were men. Well, when they noticed us trick-or-treating, one of them seemed very taken in with Robin Hood. They had given us some good candy and made us tell what we were dressed as. This wasn't really unusual. Grown-ups were in charge no matter if you knew them or not, at least back then. The man seemed to want to take pictures of the girl dressed as Robin Hood in another room with better lighting. Well, I told him, okay, then we'll all go. You can take all of our pictures. But he insisted not. He wanted only Robin to go inside. My hackles rose up immediately, and my hair stood on end. I grabbed Robin's hand tight, and my sister's hand as well. I plowed through all the men between me and the door. I ran out, holding my sister's hand, and letting go of the other girl. It seemed Robin wanted to go back. She liked the attention. I was in charge of the group though, and I told that brother and sister I was going straight to their mom if they went back inside. I liked their mom a lot, but she could be a real terror when she was angry. Needless to say, they came with me willingly, griping all the way. I took them home first, and then I told their mother what had happened. I told their mom where the house was as well. She cussed and told us to go home, so I did so. I don't know if anything else really came out of it in the end, but those men were wrong, and I know they wanted more than just pictures. So, when I was 18 years old, I worked at a local Target. This was when we used to have a wall right next to the registers, with Pokemon, baseball, other collectible cards. There was also a Starbucks in front of the register right by the front doors. For context, I'm also a female. One day, I was filling this wall with more collectible cards when this awkward, tall man came up and started looking at the Pokemon section right next to me. The man turned to me and asked very politely, "Do you like Pokemon as well?" I said yes, which then led to us talking a bit about Pokemon. I didn't really think that much of it. It just seemed like a bit of pleasant conversation about a hobby. He picked out some cards, checked out, and left. 3 days later, he returned to the store, found me, and bought me candy. Then he just told me to have a nice day. That was somewhat weird, but not really alarming yet. Eventually, though, things really started escalating. He started to come in more and more frequently, always looking specifically for me. He would start sitting at the Starbucks tables and watching me while I worked all day long. Eventually, he started buying me even more candy, Starbucks drinks, flowers, then little girls' panties, pacifiers, small child's hair accessories. Of course, I started to get freaked out at this. I tried telling my bosses what was happening, but they couldn't really do anything about it. They called the cops, but since the guy wasn't doing anything threatening, they couldn't really do anything either. One day, though, he followed me to the back room. I'd started leaving the registers whenever he would come into the store. That's when we were finally able to call the cops. He cornered me in the back room. Thankfully, I was not alone, and our stockroom guys were just out of view back there to basically save me. At this point, we were able to get a restraining order on him for the store, so he could not enter the premises anymore. That didn't stop him, though. Instead, he would just start waiting directly outside for me. Somehow, he figured out which car was mine and started leaving love notes on my vehicle for me to come out to after work. It was extremely terrifying. My mom knew as well, but once again, we couldn't really do anything. The final straw was when he actually followed me home from my work, all the way to my mother's house where I lived at the time. I had never seen his car until that day, when I noticed a strange car following me home from work. When I arrived, I rushed inside. He stood outside the house, singing love songs and reading poems he'd written me, extremely loudly as well. My mother called the cops, and we kept telling him to leave. When the cops got there, they were finally able to get him to go away. Now, though, he knew where I lived. He started leaving me notes at my house, sending me letters and packages filled with pornography, sexy outfits, girly panties, lots of baby stuff. During all of this, my mom and I were trying to get a restraining order on him ourselves and charge him for harassment, but that didn't stop him either. On the final incident, I was coming home from work when he waited around the corner of my house when I arrived, and this time he attacked me. He grabbed me by my face and dragged me down to the ground. I was screaming so loudly and so much that luckily I alerted the neighbors. They came outside to help me out. After they managed to pull him off me, he got arrested at that point. I finally had enough evidence saved up to be able to take him to court, and now he's been in jail for 8 years, due to be released in 2021. He's actually in the Gesture 4 unit. He was stalking another local girl that I connected with so we could help each other out after he got sent away. Thankfully, she was just starting to get his attention, so he never actually got the chance to hurt her. I still feel sick to my stomach whenever this memory pops back up. I was maybe 15 years old at the time, and my family had taken a trip to a ski resort in West Virginia. I'm the oldest out of 2 boys and a girl. The girl was maybe 6 at the time. She was adorable, big blue eyes and this crazy blonde hair. Bold and mature for her age because she'd grown up around all the big kids. My younger brother, who was maybe 8, and my aforementioned little sister decided to hang out in the sauna with me. We had been to the resort a few times before, and I was 15 years old. That seemed like a reasonable age to go off for an hour or so with just me and my siblings. Well, stupidly, while in the sauna, we wanted something from the hotel room, or I think wanted to tell our parents something maybe. This was before you brought a cell phone everywhere you went. In our idiocy, we decided to send my little sister to go do it. Thinking back, I really can't believe we decided to do that. But you know how immature kids think. You get the one who's the youngest to do the tedious stuff. Well, some time had passed by, and we heard my sister come pounding down the hallway in her pink bathing suit, sprinting, with an older man chasing behind her. I'll never forget how he looked. He lunged forward, walking as quickly as he could. His eyes bore into my little sister. There was a tight frown on his face, framed by his white mustache. My brother and I watched in absolute shock, trying to understand what was going on. The sauna had a glass door looking down the hallway. I rushed out and grabbed my sister, pulling her into the sauna and staring at the man with wide eyes, scared but doing my best to be defensive. The man instantly froze when he saw us and began slowing down. Then he walked by the sauna like nothing had ever happened. It was at the end of the hallway though, so there was nowhere else really to go. Because of this, he stopped for a moment, then looked to a door right on the other side of the sauna that led to the gym, and mimed an "oh," as if that was what he'd been looking for the entire time. Mind you, he was wearing a collared shirt and slacks. He actually looked like he was shaking a bit. Needless to say, I asked my sister what exactly had happened. She said shortly after leaving the hotel room, the man had come out of nowhere and started following her all over the place. She got really scared and began running. He started running after her. I told my mom what happened, and of course she was so pissed we'd sent a little girl out in a bathing suit through this big-ass hotel all by herself. I still get sick when I think about what could have happened. If he'd grabbed her before she made it to the sauna, I can still see his gross mustache in my mind, and get so angry when my mind replays his sheepish "oh," as if chasing a small girl down a hallway is a normal thing to do while looking for the gym. I felt guilty for a long time for sending her out, and guilty for not saying something to him or reporting him. I sometimes wonder if he had done this before or after. In those moments, I try to remind myself just how young I was. I'm just glad I was there with them. Had it been just her and my little brother, who knows what could have happened. I was about 15 when I got my first real job in West New York, New Jersey. My mom had sent me to live with my sister, who was 13 years older than me. She and I had recently gotten into a huge argument. So much so, in fact, that we hadn't spoken in well over a week. Because of our argument, I ended up taking the bus to work that week instead of letting her drive me there. This place always had a lot of people coming in and out. I mostly served coffee and pastries for the customers. I had just moved from New Jersey to Florida, and I've always been a relatively nice and polite person. Smile, be conversationally friendly. Well, apparently I left an impression on some man who hung around during the day to talk to me, and generally would just wait for me to get off. Again, I was 15, and this guy must have been well into his 40s. I kept on working, and as the hours passed, he would come and go, always checking in and asking if I was almost done. I remember specifically him asking a lot of questions about when I was getting off. Did I live close by? Who was picking me up? The man seemed friendly enough though, and I really didn't know better, so I kept on small talking throughout the day. I really didn't want to be rude to a customer and lose my first job. Well, I had a relatively short shift since I was so young. When my time to clock out came, I tried to leave without making a big deal about it. This guy was keeping a real close eye on me though, and started to follow me out of the establishment. He wanted to accompany me to my bus. He just wanted to make sure I'd get there okay, he said. The man grabbed me by the arm and told me to come with him. He basically stalked me the entire day, and now he saw his chance to make his move. At this point, I started to get pretty scared, since this was back before I had a cell phone, or even really before texting was invented. I didn't have a beeper either, so I had no way to call for help. I hadn't made it that far from my job yet. I was still in the parking lot. Like a bat out of hell though, my sister suddenly sped into the parking lot mad as hell. Needless to say, when she saw this guy tugging me in the opposite direction, she got even more mad. Of course she yelled at me and told me to get the fuck in the car. Then she proceeded to yell at and threaten the man who was very obviously trying to abduct me. He hauled ass away, and when she got me in the car, she started throwing out all kinds of expletives. What the fuck were you doing with him? Etc., etc. When I finally got the opportunity to tell her what actually happened, she gave me the tightest hug, and we both started crying together. To this day, this is the part we both couldn't really understand. She told me that she had been coming home from work that day when she had a sudden nagging sensation she had to pick me up from work right now. She didn't even know I was working that day, but she had the sensation that she just needed to come get me. I worked a good 20 to 30 minutes away from our home. She proceeded to ignore this persistence at first. She parked, got into the elevator, and as soon as the doors closed, something inside of her screamed, and all of the alarms went off. She came back to get me, got into her car mad as hell that she was listening to this suspicious feeling or intuition or whatever that was alarming her. She didn't even think I was out of the house, but sure enough, she got there just in time. She's never experienced something like that since or ever before. I really don't know what to make of all of that. All I know is that she saved me that day. The guy kept trying to hang around, so I quit that job shortly thereafter, and she never allowed me to ride the bus there again or leave work alone. I grew up in a fairly small town. I was allowed to walk and play a couple of blocks from home, but only with the company of one of my older brothers, and later our family dog, a super protective Rottweiler mix. That was only when I was older though. I was never allowed to leave the house by myself because my parents didn't want anything bad happening to me. In the area where I lived, there was a pretty well-known neighborhood creep, an old man, probably 60 or so in age. He lived alone in a house on the street adjacent to ours. In the house next to his lived a couple that were very good neighbors and great friends of my parents. Let's call them the Smiths. They were about the same age as my folks as well, and really loved children. Unfortunately, they couldn't have any of their own though. My parents had 7 biological kids and 4 non-biological kids. I was the youngest of all of these. There had been a few incidents where I remembered running into that neighborhood creep. One being when I was at the corner gas station with one of my brothers, when he walked up behind me, smelled my hair, and told my brother that I was delicious enough to eat. Another when I was riding with my dad in his truck. The guy flagged down my dad and asked if I was my dad's wife. I was only 10 years old at the time. He was a major creep, but there's one particular incident that always stuck with me. My siblings and I would often go over to the Smiths' house because they were really nice, they loved us, and they would let us swim in their pool, which we didn't have one of. They would also pay us for doing small odd jobs around their home. Oftentimes, when my parents were busy, they would offer to watch me. Most of my siblings were teenagers with a lot of extracurricular activities, so I would be the one left behind. One day, one of my brothers and I went over to the Smith's house. My brother was in charge of watching me that day. Mr. Smith offered my brother some money to help him move some stuff out to the front of their house for a yard sale, and to help them sell the things as well. Since I was so young and really didn't have anything to do, while the yard sale was going on, I was just sitting on their front porch playing with my Barbie doll. A few people had came and went to stop and look at the goods. Some of the items were running out, so my brother and Mr. Smith took the opportunity to go inside and go through more stuff to sell. Mrs. Smith was busy trying to help someone who was buying things. At that exact moment, came along the neighborhood creep. He looked around, trying to seem interested in buying things, and then walked right up to me. He bent down, grabbed me by my hair, and said, "How much for you?" I was incredibly shy as a child. I would cry even if strangers waved at me. Needless to say, this was too much. I literally pissed myself in fear and started crying, screaming, and wailing. I shouted repeatedly for my brother and Mr. Smith. As I did this, the man let go of my hair. Mr. Smith and my brother came running outside immediately, and the man took off quickly as well. All else that I remember is my brother picking me up and carrying me home while I was crying, while Mr. Smith tried to figure out what the hell was going on. I don't think anything ever happened to that guy in the end. A few years ago, I reconnected with an old acquaintance on social media. It started out pretty slow. He'd like things that I posted every now and then, which grew into him liking almost everything over the course of a few months. At first, I only took that as a cue that perhaps he liked me but was too shy to make a move or something. It was cute, but not something I really paid attention to. Generally, all he'd do was post cryptic lyrics, and we didn't have that much in common. Around the same time, though, I started to get this cliché feeling that I was being watched. For reference, at the time I lived in a house out in the middle of the woods, so there weren't exactly a lot of people around. There was a lot of foliage, though, so I suppose it would have been very easy to hide in the bushes or something. Our lawnmower wasn't the best, but it did work. You could adjust the height of the grass. Somehow that mechanism had broken though while my brother was out mowing the lawn one day, so we ended up with some weird patches of bald grass and some of grass that was extremely huge. No big deal. Later that night though, I saw a post from that same old acquaintance about the patterns in the grass. It seemed like it might have been a song lyric, but no matter how hard I searched, I couldn't find a song that matched up to it. I didn't really think that much yet. I was slightly startled, but maybe it's a coincidence, right? That was until I was outside the next day and realized our lawn had those same strange patterns. That mishap, plus me being a big old paranoid weirdo, got me really freaked out. I tried to calm myself down though. I mean, it's probably nothing, right? Plus, what could I even do? It's not like some lyrics proved anything. A few nights later, I got that same exact creepy feeling. So on a hunch, I went out to our front porch. It was quite large and there would be no easy way to sneak up on me, so to say. So I felt safe watching out for anything. I waited there and listened intently. Then I just sort of got the feeling and started yelling, like I knew he was there. Even though I didn't see anything around me, I yelled out that I thought he was really creepy. I talked about all the terrible things I would do to him if he ever made the mistake of coming near me, and then I went back inside and locked everything. I know this sounds really dumb and like nothing, perhaps me just being paranoid. Immediately following this incident though, he unfollowed me from all social media and stopped liking anything I posted. In fact, he stopped interacting with me altogether. When I went to his profile, he deleted that suspicious lyric about those patterns in the grass. Maybe it was all just coincidental. That's what I'd like to believe at least. Maybe he'd finally gotten sick of my ramblings, and that just happened to coincide with my speech that day. But maybe, just maybe, he was out there in the woods watching and happened to hear me say that night. This happened in the port of Scarborough of our sister island Tobago. It's quite customary for Trinidadians to take their kids to Tobago for the Easter holidays or for summer vacation. Back in '97, my mother carried us for the summer holidays. A week later, on a quiet Sunday night, we were all at the port of Scarborough, waiting for the late boat to take us back to Trinidad. It was around 9 p.m. or so, and my family and I sat in the departure lounge, waiting for the MF Panorama, which was late as usual. The passenger population was quite small, rounding up to around 20 to 30 working-class people like us. These were the days when Wi-Fi internet was yet but a dream. So the only entertainment for us passengers was this little beaten-up 32-inch CRT television that mostly just showed static. Because of this, most of the passengers began to doze off, including my mother, older brother, and younger sister. The only passengers that remained awake were a handful of old men off playing cards, myself, and the middle-aged cotton candy salesman who had his colorful assembly of wares on him. I was age 10 and a rather naive and impressionable young boy. The man, seeing me staring at his cotton candy, beckoned me over and asked which one was my favorite color. I replied that it was yellow, and to my surprise, he plucked a yellow cotton candy from his arrangement and handed it right over to me, for free. I told him I was going to wake my mother to get some money to pay him, but he informed me that it was on the house. In the back of my mind, I recalled my teachers of years ago warning us kids, don't take anything from strangers. Then again though, my mother was just a few feet away, so obviously there was no threat. I began to eat the cotton candy, and the man began to speak to me.
This place is really boring, huh?
I was amazed. He sounded just like my friends from class, with the way he phrased and uttered his sentences. It was rare when I heard adults speaking like kids. Yeah, why can't they just have a bigger TV here with cable or something? The man then mentioned he knew my father. Really? I replied in awe.
Yeah, tall, red, mixed-race man. What was his name again?
Trevor, I replied.
Yeah, that's it. Trevor is my boy. Kinda loud sometimes.
I shouted excitedly, won over by such a description. Yeah, that's my father. He asked how Trevor was doing, and I gave a long account of my father's history and personal problems, how him and my mother separated a long time ago. Then I started speaking of school and my friends. He kept on interjecting about my father, and how sad it was I didn't have a father figure in my life. It irritated me a bit, but I continued nonchalantly chatting away to my new friend about every random thing that came to mind.
Hey, you want to see a ship sailing in?
How? I replied.
Upstairs, come on. There's a nice view. You can see the entire ocean.
The whole ocean? Can you see Trinidad from up there?
Yeah, of course you can. You can see anything, little buddy.
We went upstairs together to the second-floor lounge, which was practically devoid of life. There was only one single lady, who was stood at the rails staring at the ship that was 100 yards away. The man took me to the furthest side of the room, and we stared at the sea. He began pointing at made-up locations of where random things should be. At this point, the lady finished her sightseeing and left. Immediately, I felt the old Cotton's arm drape around my shoulders.
I don't have a son, you know, only daughters,
he said in a much more mature tone now. Okay.
This feels good, huh? Ever wanna travel the world?
I didn't answer him. It didn't feel good. It felt weird. I thought he would have removed his arm by now, but instead he gripped me even tighter. Something was not right about this. To make things worse, we were now completely alone. Suddenly, I heard a voice calling out from downstairs. Elijah, where the hell did you go? Elijah! It was my mother's voice. Apparently, she had just woken up and seen I was missing. The old men playing cards informed her immediately of where I'd gone and who I'd gone with. She wasted no time in sounding the alarm. I was grateful for her intervention. I went away from the cotton candy man and back downstairs, where almost the entire population of passengers stood, eager to see who was this Elijah, the would-be victim. My older brother was standing there swollen-eyed and irritated from being startled awake. As I approached my family, my brother mumbled something like, "Going upstairs with a man, are you gay or something?" Rather than feeling safe to be with my family and out of that man's eerie grasp, I suddenly felt very embarrassed. My mother continued her big scene, holding nothing back, calling the man a rapist and a sicko. A person ventured upstairs to grab the cotton candy man, but came back down saying the floor was now completely empty. He'd somehow found a way to escape everyone down below. I was rather angry at the time at my mother for embarrassing me like that, but as I've grown older, I became more grateful for her quick-witted reaction, saving me from being kidnapped or worse. This happened a few years ago to me when I was still living in my childhood home down in California. I had just inherited this family home, so my cousin decided to move in with my husband and I while she was attending college nearby. My cousin and I were both working at the Lego store at the time. I only worked mornings though, and my husband and cousin worked nights, so there were many nights where I was home alone. A couple of weeks before this incident happened, I had been taking stuff out to my car when I realized a large brown van with no back windows was parked just across the street. As I put the stuff in the trunk, the man in the van started making weird noises at me. I turned to see if I could get a good look at his face, but his black Giants baseball cap was pulled all the way down. Thinking this was just your standard creepy guy, I flipped him off and went back into my place. About 2 hours later, I went outside to go somewhere, only to realize he was still parked across the street. I didn't really think anything of it at the time though. I hopped in my car and headed over to my friend's house. As I was driving, I looked in my rear view mirror, only to see the same brown van now following me. I turned on a whole bunch of different streets, and he followed me down all of them. I turned onto the road that my father-in-law lived on and parked there, thinking that if the guy tried anything, I could just run to his place and be safe. When I pulled over in front of my father-in-law's house, the van drove slowly by. I could see into the van now. I saw the man put his hand into a gun position and point at me. He said bang really loudly, and after that he hauled ass and drove off. Now, I had always been a little bit leery of staying home alone. My house had always given me the creeps because of how poorly lit it was. When I was home alone at night, I usually stayed in the kitchen because it was really bright. I was watching a TV show on my computer when all of a sudden I heard a banging on the front door and the handle started to jiggle. This startled me for a moment until I looked up at the time and saw it was around 10 p.m. That was around the time my cousin would be coming home from work. I got up and opened the door, but nobody was there on the porch. I shouted out my cousin's name, but there was still no response. This caused me to call my cousin's cell. "Oh, hey, I'm on my way home from work right now." Before I could say anything else, there were 3 extremely loud bangs on the door that connected the kitchen and the garage, and the knob was shaken violently. I slammed the front door closed immediately, locked and chained it, and sprinted for my room. My aunt called me, while my cousin called the police. I stayed under a blanket until my cousin got home. When she came and got me, I was led outside to talk to the police. I was trying to explain everything that had happened, but the officers along the side of my house were distracting me. I walked over to where they were, but one of the officers held me back. They opened the gate and saw the door to my garage was wide open. All of the officers in the area pulled out their guns and went into the garage, but nobody was there. Afterwards, the police told me it was probably just some kids messing around, but if I ever get scared at home to call them, and they'd send someone out. About a week later, I was watching something in my living room with my cousin and my husband. As I was passing by the window next to my front door, I happened to realize there was a guy wearing the same baseball cap as the guy in the van, standing outside on the sidewalk. He was just staring at my house. When he noticed I'd seen him watching me, he immediately locked eyes with me and gave me the creepiest smile I had ever seen. I turned and yelled for my husband to go out there, but when I turned around, he was already gone. I will say though that the baseball cap in question was really generic, and a lot of Giants fans wear it. I can't quite say it was the same exact guy for sure, but it sure would be a huge coincidence if it wasn't. 3 days after that, I was home alone at night again. I was obviously very on edge, but trying to ignore it, telling myself nothing was going to happen. I was baking cookies in the kitchen when I thought I heard a knock at my sliding glass door. My whole body tensed up, and I slowly turned to face the noise. The lights in the backyard were off, and the kitchen ones were on. The glare in the window made it impossible to see if someone was outside. Everything was silent for a few seconds, before I heard a banging on the door once again. I screamed, paralyzed in fear. The person ran on the deck from the sliding glass door to the 2 windows in the living room and started knocking on them as well. They came back to the sliding glass door to knock, and then started trying to force open the door. Finally, I came to my senses. I grabbed my keys and ran outside to my car. I locked myself in there and dialed 911. We sold that house shortly after that. I still have a hard time staying home alone, even though I'm 2 states away now. I moved to South Korea for university when I turned 18 years old. I'm 21 now, so this happened over 2 years ago now. Whilst there's definitely been unwanted attention from some guys in the past, most of them get the message that I'm not interested eventually. This, however, was a little bit more unsettling. The university I go to has an institute for language, which is where all of my classes were at the time. It's pretty common knowledge that most foreigners in this part of Korea would know of or study at this institute. It was not abnormal for me to receive random Facebook friend requests from guys wanting to learn English or make foreign friends. Most of the time, I'd just ignore them, unless we had a few mutual friends or I'd met them in person before. I got a friend request from this guy named Nico. We had quite a handful of mutual friends, and he'd messaged me too, saying he was sorry for the randomness of the request. He was just trying to make as many foreign friends as he could. Because he had so many mutual friends, I thought, what the heck? I accepted and messaged him back saying it wasn't really a bother. From what I could tell by his Facebook photos, he was heavily pierced and tattooed, and stated he was Japanese. He had studied in Canada and could speak good English, and was also a foreigner studying at my university. After a few days, he messaged me again and I replied. It was a fairly casual conversation, and would often bring up maybe meeting for a coffee or a movie, which I declined. Suddenly though, he started getting more aggressive for no reason. Every time I'd make a comment, he'd find some way to turn it into an argument, which grew tiring super fast. I started to just ignore him. He'd often ask if I had a boyfriend, to which I'd reply no, and he'd bluntly say we should be together. It was at this point I decided I really didn't want anything more to do with him. I politely declined on the basis that I didn't know him, we'd never met in person, and we hadn't even known each other a full week. He didn't take my refusal very well. He began throwing insults at me based on my looks, and saying overly graphic things he'd do to me if he ever saw me. Evidently, I was being stupid not to take him up on the offer, because I'd never do better than him and he'd make me see that. It creeped me out beyond belief, needless to say, so I just blocked and deleted him on everything and tried to forget about it. I mentioned this to a friend of mine, and she immediately knew exactly who I was talking about. Apparently, I was not the first girl he'd added on Facebook and tried to bully into meeting him and being his girlfriend. After asking around with a few more of my friends who were listed as those mutual friends on Facebook, they all described pretty much the exact same situations involving this guy. One girl even told me she'd given him the benefit of the doubt and met up with him. It turned out he didn't even go to our university. He lived over an hour away and would travel there daily to watch and obsess over which girl he would find on Facebook next. He also told her he was born in America and had never even been to Japan, so who knows how much of what he said to anyone was actually true. I felt a bit freaked out by this, but I tried not to let it bother me. After all, I'd never actually seen him around, and I'd blocked him, so what more could happen? That was until about a week or two later. I received a message from him on Facebook from a different account, saying how he'd seen me that day at school. This shook me up a lot, since I hadn't even considered that he might actually be watching me in person. I ignored the message and blocked that account too. A few days later, I got numerous messages, all from different accounts claiming to be Nico's friends. They were saying how he'd had his account hacked. Could I please unblock him so he could just explain everything and we could talk it over? I ignored all of these messages too. I just kept receiving more and more though, all of which I'm pretty sure were just Nico himself trying to reach out to get my attention. the more I ignored them, the more violent and aggressive the messages became. I could tell that most of the time when he said he'd seen me, he was lying. He'd say things like, "I saw you at the library today, you fucking slut. You're a fucking four-eyed slut who can't get laid," and other messages to that extent. I knew he was clutching at straws because I never used the school's library to study, and although I wear glasses, I never wear them in public. Because of this, I was fairly confident he was all bluster. I just kept blocking the accounts and tried not to let it bother me too much. I figured he'd get bored enough soon and let it go. That was until one day after classes had finished. I was browsing the small convenience store in the building to grab a drink on my way home. I opened up the fridge to get a bottle of water, and when I closed the door, he was standing right there beside me. He didn't say anything. He just stared daggers at me. I hadn't ever seen him in person before. I'd never agreed to meet him, but I knew straight away this was him. Obviously, I freaked out. I dropped the bottle in place and sprinted out of the store. I didn't walk straight home because I was afraid he'd follow me and find out where I lived. Instead, I went back into school and stayed around areas where there were lots of people until a friend of mine came to meet me. After that, I'd see him all the time when I'd leave class. He'd just be standing there, doing nothing in particular, watching people as they walked past. Then he'd stare at me intently. I made sure to always be with friends when I went to and from class from then on, and didn't go anywhere alone for a while. After a week or so, though, the messages suddenly stopped, and I didn't ever see him again. The last time I heard from him was about a year ago, when he messaged me on yet a new Facebook account, asking if we could be friends again because he'd changed, and it was all just a joke. Needless to say, I ignored that message, blocked that account too, and will not be taking up his offer on being friends. I was mindlessly browsing Facebook one day when I received a message to my inbox. Clicking on it, I realized it was from someone who I didn't know. His name was Peter, and he sent me this. "Hi, I was taken aback by how beautiful you are in your picture. I hope you don't find that too forward. I saw you post on insert local company's name here, Wall. I thought your comment was pretty funny. I couldn't resist clicking on your profile and messaging you. Your sense of humor is just like mine, and I'd like to thank you for making me laugh today. I just lost my mother a few months ago, you see, and I've had a real hard time with it. I can't remember the last time I smiled, let alone laughed, so really, thank you." Now, normally I would not reply to messages from people I don't know, but I felt really bad for this guy. I thanked him and told him I was sorry for his loss, and I was glad I could help him laugh. Once he sent me a friend request, I had to let him know, though, I didn't have any intentions of adding him. I only used Facebook for people I know. The guy said he understood, and we said our goodbyes. I thought that would be it. One day, about a week after getting his initial message, though, I was out shopping at the local grocery store nearby my home, when I noticed a guy looking at me from a few feet away down the aisle I was in. I looked over and smiled nervously. I'm somewhat shy and socially awkward. He smiled back and waved, then looked at what was in front of him. He looked familiar, but I couldn't quite put my finger on from where. I checked out with my groceries and went home. After putting everything away, I sat down and logged on to Facebook, only to see I had a new message from him. "I like the dress you wore today. It fit your body nicely. Thanks for smiling at me. It made me feel real special." I didn't realize that was him at the store, but seeing his picture again on Facebook definitely matched that guy. I was sort of sketched out by this, but of course it could have just been a coincidence. We did live in the same area after all. I chose not to engage though, just to be safe. About another week goes by and I hadn't heard anything else from him. I was out with some friends at night at a park, just hanging out on the swings like we do when we were teenagers, when I noticed someone off in the distance. They were walking toward the park. My friends and I got spooked and went quiet immediately. I realized when the person was a bit closer that it was Peter. I spoke to my friends in a quiet voice. "Don't panic. Act natural, but we need to leave now. Get in the car." They didn't argue. We got in the car together and drove away. Peter was now gone, though. I told my friends who that was and what had been going on. They told me I was just being paranoid. When I got home, though, I realized I had another message on Facebook again, once more from him. "So, do you go to that park often?" I noped the fuck out and replied, "Do not ever message me again. My boyfriend is aware of the situation and he's a police officer, so leave me alone." I blocked him. Even though I made up the boyfriend thing to scare him, I guess it must have worked. I haven't heard from him or seen him again in months. I live with 3 people who all know what he looks like and know about the situation as well. They've been keeping a lookout and nothing suspicious has happened so far. That doesn't mean that I don't look over my shoulder every now and then, though. When I was around 9, I went to summer camp at the nearby YMCA for a few summers. It was a day camp, and there were different camps you could do. You know, water sports, crafts, canoeing. Each camp lasted for about 1 week. I started the summer by taking one of the craft camps, a special one that lasted for 2 weeks. I was really excited about it, but I was also nervous. I didn't know anyone else in my group, and I was also very shy. The first day, I managed to make friends with an older kid who was in a wheelchair. He was around 17, I believe. I'm not sure what his disability was, but he was very socially awkward and gave off kind of a creepy vibe. I was trying to be nice to him because no one else wanted to talk to him, but he started to make me very uncomfortable. First, he started by talking about how much he hated being in the wheelchair because it made his back hurt. He liked being able to get out at the end of the day and stretch, as well as do some exercises with his physical therapist. That wasn't too bad. I just smile and nod as he talked, not really having too much else to add. At some point, I mentioned to him how I was a dancer and really liked acrobatics class. He asked me to show him some of my moves, so I did a cartwheel. He told me my legs looked beautiful when I stretched them out like that. Being a kid, I didn't really think much of that comment. I did start getting a bit uncomfortable though when he began to tell me about how much he liked my hair, how white my teeth were, how cute I was because I was so little. One day he was talking about stretching outside his wheelchair and mentioned how good it would feel if someone were to walk on his back. "You'd be perfect, just the right size. Would you do that for me one day? I'd love to have you on top of me." He smiled very creepily when he said this. I awkwardly changed the direction of the conversation by telling him how I used to do that for my dad. I was young and stupid. I probably shouldn't have egged him on like that. He got really excited and started talking about how much he'd love it, how good it must have felt for my dad. I bet he loves having his little girl on top of him like that. He reached out to me at this point and put his hand on my knee. I awkwardly shrugged it off and moved away a little. He smiled and started talking about how good it would feel to do cartwheels on his back and jump on him, maybe lie down on top of him and rub his sides. Luckily, my mom drove up a moment later and I was able to leave. This was on the weekend, and the camp was going to continue the following Monday. I didn't mention anything to my mom. I figured he was just lonely and awkward and hadn't meant to be creepy. When I got to camp on Monday, he immediately ran up to me. "I was so upset I couldn't see you this weekend. I missed my little girl." I smiled and awkwardly walked away, but he followed me. We were all going as a group to the craft cabin. He came up next to me and asked if I wanted to sit in his lap and ride to the cabin with him. I politely declined and managed to avoid him for the rest of the day, until I was walking to my mom's car at the very end. He came up to me, grabbed my hand and pulled me towards him. "You know, you really hurt me today. How would you like it if I hurt you too?" I yanked my hand away and walked quickly to the car. I told my mom all about it as soon as I got in. She drove immediately over to the camp office and spoke to the camp leader about it. I told him everything. He assured us he would take care of it immediately. As we were driving away after the meeting, I saw 2 counselors go up to the boy and lead him into the office. The look on his face was like he was going to kill someone. I never saw him again after that. I was told he was kicked out and never allowed to return. For the rest of the week, the camp counselors would check on me and make sure I was okay, too. So this was told to me by an old family friend, Nikki, numerous times as a kid growing up. It was told as one of those life advice stories to keep in mind through the years, and to her credit, I sure have never forgotten it. Whenever anything associated with hitchhiking comes up, it always springs to mind, and probably always will. Makes me a bit ill whenever I think about it, really. So, Nikki, who grew up at the same time as my dad, so this was about the early 80s, I believe, was a young woman at the time in her mid-20s. She was one of those real kind-hearted souls, always willing to help another out in a time of need, you know? I can't imagine her being anything other than what she was when she was younger, so I can totally see her doing this too. Driving into the city, about a 2-hour or so drive out from town, she saw a man walking down the side of the road. As she neared, he turned and, in typical hitchhiker manner, stuck out the old arm and thumb. Nikki, bless her heart, pulled over and asked the man if he needed any help. She told me he was really polite, if not a bit shy. He only asked her for a lift into the city. Nikki gave a big smile and popped open the passenger door for the man, who tossed his bag into the back seat and buckled up for the ride ahead. In all honesty, they talked fairly pleasantly for most of the trip. Friends, the news, the typical happy small talk. She felt like they were getting on really well, and even bought him dinner at the pit stop a little over halfway there. He seemed really flustered and awkward when she paid, but one of the things they had talked about was money, and how he was pretty dang strapped for cash at the time. That was why he'd been hitchhiking in the first place. He eventually relented though, and they went on their way. As soon as they got into the city, he thanked her profusely for the ride and the food, and asked to be dropped off once they hit downtown. Before getting out, he asked for Nikki's phone number so he could contact her again someday and catch up. Thrilled at the prospect of knowing how her new friend was faring, Nikki wrote it down for him and drove off with the warm feelings of a good deed done. Now, I'm sorry if you're expecting something creepy to have happened by now, but I think this part is what freaked me out so much as a kid. How nice everything seemed to have worked out. Nikki always gets this crease in her forehead and a funny look in her eye when she tells me the next part. About a week later, she got a phone call from her new driving buddy. He didn't let her get a single word in edgewise after hello, and immediately told her, "You should be thanking God you were raised so nice. When I first got in your car, I was planning on raping and murdering you once we got to that pit stop. I was gonna steal that car and dump your body in a ditch further down the road and go on my merry way. But you talked to me so kindly and treated me to dinner with a smile on your face. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I couldn't live with myself after doing that to such a nice lady. So please, Nikki, never ever pick up another hitchhiker." Then he hung up the phone. Nikki never got a call from him again, and when she tried to redial the number, all she got was a payphone. This is my aunt's encounter. To set the scene, where I live, it's normal that lots of people commute to the big city from the outskirts for work. What I mean is that most of them agree to pay and rent a bus that will drive them to and from work on a daily basis. It's especially popular among nurses, basic office workers, and so on. Young people who don't have or can't yet afford their own cars. The bus will usually take off from a regular bus stop. One day, my aunt was traveling to work by car. It was quite early, probably somewhere around 7 a.m. since she starts at 8. She approached the bus stop, only to see a man waving at cars passing by. He was fairly nicely dressed. A jacket, polished shoes, that kind of stuff. And he was holding a briefcase. Usually, she would not take a stranger in. But come on, this guy must be an office worker. Judging by his looks, he'd probably missed the bus. She decided to be nice and stop by and invite him in. The guy was more than happy. Very talkative as well, so off they go. As the journey proceeds, she's getting more and more comfortable. The guy was young, 25-ish maybe, and very funny and easy to talk to. They were getting closer and closer to the city, when the hitchhiker says that since they'll most definitely be stuck in traffic on the main road, they better take a less attended one. No red flags going off yet. I mean, he's right. He also wasn't giving any bad vibes at all. Now, what you need to know. This specific city is quite wild. I mean, foreigners will visit and say, wow, it sure is green here. I'll not reveal the exact location, but it's surrounded on all sides by forests. There are actually some forests in the city as well. You'll see nice and flashy office buildings on one side of the river and deep forests on the other. It's crucial for the story. It didn't really matter if you took the main or less attended roads, you'd still get to the city in the end. They drive on, forest all around, which the guy comments on, saying how nice it all looks and blah blah blah. My aunt was smiling and nodding along, and that's when the creepy part kicked in. He turned his head to her and said in a completely normal, lackadaisical voice, "You know, you would look real good in a coffin." And the guy went completely quiet after that utterly horrific statement, gripping his hands on the briefcase tight. She was beyond creeped out now, but tried not to show it and played it cool. And that's when an idea popped into her head. She slowed down and said something must be wrong with the engine, because it was getting hard for her to navigate. She drove over to the side of the road and asked the man if he could be so nice as to get out and check for her since she's a woman. She wouldn't know what to do, blah blah blah. He instantly agreed and hopped out of the car. That's when she withdrew and drove the fuck away, leaving that creepy hitchhiker behind. She didn't really care that she'd left him there all alone. What he'd said was creepy as hell. After a few kilometers, she calmed down though, congratulating herself on getting rid of him so quickly, when she noticed that his briefcase was still laying on the passenger seat. What would a normal person do in this case? Probably throw it away or something. But she couldn't resist having a look inside, and believe me, the inside made her nauseous. Instead of papers or pens or documents or whatever else office boys would carry around in their briefcase, she found a neatly folded thin rope and a set of knives as well. Not one, a set of sharp, nice knives. You'd think the guy was a hunter or something, except he was not. Of course, she was freaked out and decided to go to the nearest police station to report what just happened and give them the briefcase as well. As usual here though, the police did not do much. No one fit the description of the man, and the original hitchhiker could not be located after. After that, she never picked up another. I don't think I would either if that happened to me. If you spend enough nights camping, eventually some weird things will happen. A couple of years ago, two buddies and I did a month-plus long trip around the U.S. We would camp in U.S. Forest Service or Bureau of Land Management areas, and were driving my pickup truck. We would get back in some fairly deep wilderness on forest roads. After about 15 nights on our trip, we ended up in some BLM land near Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park in Colorado. It was our very last night in Colorado, and we were exhausted from doing a 14er earlier that morning. We found the coordinates of the campsite online and arrived to the edge of the pavement at about 6 p.m. or so. Ahead of us was a dusty 2-track lane that snaked down through some scraggy trees and bush and made its way to the top of a hill that had views of snow-capped peaks. We hadn't passed a car in a very long time as we drove out there. Our truck made it to the site easily enough, but none of us got out yet. We sat inside and took a bit of a look around. There was a fire pit, lots of trees, but also an abandoned couch and other signs of human waste. Not exactly great vibes. Still though, it was getting pretty late, and we weren't keen on driving even more in the dark. We hopped out and started walking around, cautiously approaching some garbage bags wrapped up in duct tape. I remember joking that this seemed like a place where we would find a body or something to my friends. They all agreed. It was a very eerie atmosphere. We noticed a trail that seemed to go in a circle around the top of the hill, so we decided to check that out before we committed to staying the night. We found some more trash, human waste, but nothing that made us feel like we needed to leave. We decided to cowboy camp, aka sleep on a tarp beneath the stars, and got a nice fire going. We finished off a case of beer, but even with the inebriation, we were suddenly feeling very uneasy. Every couple of minutes or so, one of us would shine a light off into the woods thinking we'd just heard something. Even though this was our 20th consecutive night sleeping outside, something just didn't feel right. Still though, it was really late now, so we started getting ready for bed. After all, we were all carrying bear spray and headlamps, so what was the worst that could happen? I stepped out into the woods to pee and walked about 15 feet without turning on my light. As I'm standing there peeing, I decide I should turn on my headlamp since the fire had messed up my night vision. When I see what the beam of light illuminates, my knees nearly buckled. My jaw was dropped. I stood there in silence for 10 seconds before calling out to my friends. "Hey guys, do you see this?" As I shone my beam around the area, I could see tons of bleached bones all wrapped in barbed wire, hanging from branches directly above the trail we had just walked in daylight. Certainly, we would have noticed those before. They had to have been hung once it got dark, while we sat only 25 feet away. Well, as we observed this field of bones, the consensus among us was, well, fuck that. We snapped a couple of photos of it before throwing our things in the truck and driving away. We drove a ways up the road to the National Park Campground. I had never felt so safe to pay $25 to have neighbors nearby. My hypothesis is that it might have been a rancher or something with a grazing lease putting up the bones to scare off scum that leave their trash at the campsites. They were probably just cow bones, but needless to say, it definitely scared the hell out of me. I recently received a friend request that reminded me of this story. This happened after I went to university, so I was about 18 years old at the time. I had made an effort to make friends after I moved onto campus, and ended up with a few groups to hang out with, including a new girlfriend and plenty of people from my classes that I liked well enough. There was one class before lunch where it was traditional for people to go to the cafeteria afterwards to eat in pairs or threes. I wasn't very discerning about who I'd go with, because I got along fine with most people from the class, and we were all sort of trying to make an effort to be social at that age. This meant that when one particular girl, Lily, asked if I wanted to go eat lunch together after that class, I didn't have any reason to refuse. We talked about school and mostly pretty casual stuff. Nothing really noteworthy. She did ask me to get lunch with her again the next week, though. Soon it became a pattern, and there wasn't exactly a way to start saying no suddenly. It was fine with me, but it did mean I lost the chance to eat lunch with anyone else on those days, which sort of hindered my social life a little. In hindsight, I suppose that was the point, though. One day in class, I asked someone if I could add them on social media, and this just happened to occur in front of Lily. Immediately, I saw her face jerk towards me from a couple seats over. It was such a sharp reaction that it was hard to ignore. I still remember it even to this day. Needless to say, by the time I'd gotten home later, Lily had already sent me a friend request. We had no friends in common either. I don't even know how she knew my last name. I was a bit surprised, but I guess maybe she dug through the university's social media pages and found me through there or something. I did get a bad feeling, but surely this was fine. She ended up messaging me quite a lot and commenting on anything I posted. I told myself she was just awkward. We became friends, if not close, and I'd known worse people. She still always got me to go eat lunch with her after our shared class. Other than that, though, we very rarely had any time together in person. I would see her around sometimes, but I never went out of my way to hang out with her, you know? This meant it was mostly online messaging and seeing each other in group settings. Coincidentally, my girlfriend was also called Lily. This was something that clearly bothered the other Lily. She occasionally hinted that she wanted my girlfriend to pick a different name, or joked about it not suiting her. Clearly, she did not like my girlfriend at all, and I had an idea as to why. It was getting hard to ignore by this point. Lily was starting to unsubtly hint that she had a crush on me. I tried my best not to address it. I mean, what was I gonna say? I'd never known what to do when a friend tried to make a pass at me. I was also not interested in the very least. Even ignoring some of the weird stuff she did, Lily was just not my type. She tended to act and dress in a way somewhere between a 50s housewife and all those adults still obsessed with Disney princesses, if you can picture that combination. Things took an uncomfortable turn on the day of our last shared class of the year. Instead of asking me to lunch like she usually did, she asked if I'd go out for a walk with her. Again, I didn't know how to refuse, so I said a small one would be fine. Our campus was bordered by a large patch of woodland. Lily led me out into the woods, and the sounds of our fellow students slowly faded away. She sat down on a log and I joined her. She started talking about how much she was going to miss me over the summer. I tried placating her, but I really didn't want to be there, especially because she seemed to be on the verge of tears. I tried to make an excuse about having plans with my girlfriend, but before I could say anything, Lily chose to lean in and kiss me without warning. It was uncomfortable, to say the least. I got out of there and was happy to think I would not see her for a while. I came back to university after summer, moving into a house with my friends. Without going off topic, there were some serious issues in that group. Lots of petty arguing and even worse. I broke up with my girlfriend around the start of that school year as well. Basically, the whole mess made me recontextualize things with Lily. It didn't seem quite so bad after all that drama. That said, I still didn't want to be alone with her. We mostly just talked online. She was still constantly messaging me every day after all. One upside of everything was that I started dating a boy. Lily was not pleased to hear that news. I think she hoped to kinda sneak in after I broke up with my girlfriend, but as I said before, that was never going to happen. This is where the story gets bad. At this time, I was fairly active on Tumblr. I occasionally talked about my life and mostly just reblogged photos and things I found interesting. I was on there one day when something odd happened. One of the blogs I followed had received an ask with some phrases I recognized. It took a second to register that it was taken from my About page. That made me freeze. I read the message properly. Someone was asking this completely random person to analyze a section of text from my page, asking for their opinion on the type of person who would write it. I cannot stress how messed up it was to see people talking about me like I was a character in a book or something. The important thing, though, was that the question had not been anonymous. It linked to someone's blog. Obviously, I wanted to know who had taken such a bizarre interest in me in particular. As far as I knew, not a single person in real life knew about my page. It's not like I shared it around or anything. No prizes for guessing who was behind it. What I found was disturbing. It was almost like a shrine. She was using a fake name, but I recognized Lily all over that thing. It was this cutesy pink and red page. There were a few posts about her interest, but most of the content was focused on her primary interest, me. Most of the posts were all about me. There were accounts of things I'd done recently, places I'd been, groups I participated in, going to the nightclub recently, as well as references to things as far back as I'd known her. It was clear she'd been keeping tabs on me, both online and offline, gathering every scrap of information she could about my life and hoarding it in this little collection. She talked about us eating lunch together, how special our dates had been to her, as if it was anything more than acquaintances just getting food after class. She even talked about the time she had forcibly kissed me in the woods. She quoted lyrics from all of my favorite songs, even though I'd never talked about them, and talked about how she'd always be there for me, no matter who else came into my life. Lots of references to loving me just the way he is as well, which answered another mystery about some anonymous love letters I'd been receiving earlier that year with the same wording. It got worse. There were a lot of posts about my boyfriend as well. Those were not so nice. It was angry and hateful. I didn't like to think of the sort of person who could write so obsessively being fixated on me. One thing that didn't make sense at first was that the blog had also made plenty of references to this best friend, Steven. She had never mentioned this person to me, and I'd never seen anyone else around her either. Her post talked a lot about Steven and how great a friend he was, how much fun they had together, how much he looked out for her. I was trying to work out whether this was an online friend or something, when one specific post made it all click. She had posted a photo and captioned it, "Steven sent this to me. He knew I would like it." The problem was, it was a photo taken straight from my page. I had not sent that to her. She took it from my page and then claimed I was her fictional best friend, because in her head she'd split me into two people, the two most important people in her life. In her messed up fantasies, I was both her perfect best friend and her soulmate who was going to end up with her. Who was she complaining to? Oh, she had an audience all right. People who took what she said at face value. I saw a bunch of random people agreeing with this stalker, things like my boyfriend didn't deserve me, we were bound to break up soon, I would be with Lily, the person I was clearly destined to be with. She had this fake fanfiction version of my life up for anyone to share their opinion on, and she made herself out to be the hero of it all, of course. I had only gone maybe a month back into this page's history, and I didn't look at everything that was there. It was too much, and I didn't want to see if there was anything from before I'd known her. Needless to say, I sent Lily a message confronting her about this blog. She said nothing. I can't stress how weird it was to have found pages and pages dedicated to me. Then she just acted like it never happened. She said nothing. Didn't even address it, just changed the subject like I'd never even said it, like she hadn't even registered that it existed. I've never seen deflection quite like it. Well, of course, afterward she deleted the page, or at least changed the name and hid it, because I could never find it again. That was not the end, though. I was not going to hang out with her anymore, but we were still shoved together in classes. She had started to actually scare me with what she might do next. I'm kind of a paranoid person already, so knowing someone was obsessively keeping track of me for who knows how long really scared me a lot. The next thing she pulled was trying to seduce my boyfriend. That was a useless attempt. What was her plan there? Did she hope to tell me he cheated and wait for me to break up with him or something? Why would I want her after that? When that didn't work, she tried to seduce all of my friends. None of them took the bait, thankfully. She ended up dating one of my former housemates for a while, but made sure to send me messages every day while they were together, letting me know she'd rather be with me instead. Lily made sure to stay in my life the entire time I was at university. There was a time when I tried to pull away from her, and she ended up starting these malicious rumors about me and damaging a career opportunity I'd put a lot of time into. I don't know all of what she did behind my back, but it made me realize it might be safer to just let her think she was a part of my life while ignoring her, rather than do something that would cause her to get angry. I knew at this point she really didn't have any reservations about hurting me to get what she wanted. After I graduated, Lily of course still wanted to hang around me, but now I didn't have that additional impetus of school keeping me there. I made excuses about work and barely talked to her after that point. I had entirely stopped posting on social media I knew she knew about. Of course, she would not give up that easily. Usually, I ignored all of her attempts though. I didn't think she was still tracking me online, but in hindsight, she probably was. I don't know how, but she'd reference things I mentioned online somewhere else she couldn't have known about. The last time we had a conversation for real, she sent me a message out of nowhere. We hadn't spoken at all in months, and we hadn't talked about anything serious in much longer than that. Thinking about that conversation still makes my skin crawl. At first, she asked me some questions about how long I'd known I was queer. I told her some basic stuff, the kind of things I'd tell anyone who asked. Then she changed the subject. She started talking about how I would feel about her if she was a boy, about wanting to be a boy for me. The messages quickly became fetishistic. Again, we were not even friends at this point. We'd never been especially close, and we'd barely spoken for years. I can't imagine sending messages like that even to a close friend, let alone someone who barely knew you. I tried telling her not to pull this crap with me, and then she decided to change tactics. She started role-playing as me. The worst part is that she seemed to believe it was real, that those things had actually happened to her, even when she was quoting me word for word. Things I'd told her only hours before were now part of her life. It was like she was trying to absorb me or something, to take over my history, to make my life a part of her. Yeah, I really didn't want to talk to her again after that. I ignored future attempts she made and eventually silently deleted her from the inactive social media, which was her only real way of contacting me. I really thought she might finally move on. But then I started getting more friend requests on everywhere. They're still sitting there unanswered because I know if I delete them, she'll somehow find a way to seek me out elsewhere. Lily and I met nearly 12 years ago. This story is just the highlights, and even then, it's only the stuff I knew about for sure. A lot happened behind my back. I just know it did. I was around 18 years old at the time, sitting in my bedroom, and no bullshit, watching The Purge for the first time. My bedroom window only had one latch out of the two locked, because I would smoke out of it at night, being too afraid to go outside alone around 1 a.m. During the entire movie though, I kept hearing this light scratching. I thought it was probably just another cat under the house or something. After about 5 minutes though, I paused the movie, only to hear it again, this time much louder. I was getting kind of creeped out. I reached under my curtain and pushed the unlocked side of my window down, then locked it fully. Looking back in hindsight, the fact that one part of my window was fucking pried open should have alarmed me. I sat back down, only to hear a loud slam come from the bathroom. I ran out to go check. The blinds had fallen off the window. I ran straight to my parents' bedroom, and my dad immediately knew something was very wrong. He hopped up in all of his manly glory with his .45 and his tighty-whitey undies and ran out the back door to search the yard. He didn't see anyone, and we decided to call the cops in the morning. My nephew was staying overnight, and we figured there was really no point in freaking him out over what we felt was nothing. The next day, we decided to take a look around though. We found my window had scratch marks from a crowbar, and the ledge was dented, as if someone was really trying to pry my window open. Whoever it was had worn socks on their hands to try and push up the glass, because there weren't any handprints either. There were just these long and dragged out marks the size of adult hands going upward. Mind you, my windows were very dirty, so it was easy to see. We lived in a very small town in Louisiana, so the police chief who knew my parents came to the house after a formal report. For some reason, he kept insisting it must be either a friend or maybe a boyfriend who couldn't get in touch with me. One, everyone I know knew my dad was always well armed and would not play around with that shit. And two, my cell was always on, and I always answered, especially for friends, even at 1 in the morning. And for an additional third point, that's the dumbest fucking thing I've ever heard in my life. Friends don't wear socks on their hands and try to jimmy your window open just to see you. At least not without calling out your name first. We never did find out who did this or what they wanted. What still scares me even 10 years later, though, is that the house was not quiet. There was a TV and a lamp or two on in the living room. The bathroom light was on as well, and my bedroom was very well lit since I was watching a horror movie. Yet this person still tried to get in through 2 different windows. The worst part is that if our bathroom window was not so shitty and useless, they would have absolutely made it in. To keep it open, my mom would use an old broom handle to hold it up, and unless there was something keeping it up like that, it would immediately slam back down. This is likely why the blinds came off, and that loud slam I'd heard as well. It may just be me, but I'm pretty sure whoever it was wanted something in our house so badly that they didn't care who was inside or if they were awake. If I would have opened that curtain before locking my window, maybe it would have scared them off. Or maybe it would have motivated them even more to come in and get me instead. In September of 2018, I met this guy, Andrew, through a mutual friend on our birthday. Andrew had taken an interest in me immediately, but I was kinda clueless until several of my friends pointed it out. Andrew began texting me a lot, and we eventually started hanging out all on our own. A couple of weeks passed by, and eventually we started dating as well. That's when things started to get weird, though. Whenever I would hang out with my friends, he'd get very aggressive about me not spending time with him instead. One weekend, I had seen him almost every day that week. On Friday morning, we had plans to hang out as well, but I was feeling sick that day, so I had to cancel. Later that night, I had a Halloween party, and I was feeling better from earlier, so I decided to go. Needless to say, he got very angry at me, saying I never wanted to spend time with him and all sorts of abusive language. Other weird things were happening as well, but in the end, I told him I wanted to end things via text. I was a bit scared to tell him in person, honestly. He didn't take it very well at all. He would constantly message me after, asking if we could meet up in person to talk, at the park no less. I just kept saying I thought it best that we did not. After I rebuffed him that way, he began to ask all of my friends for my class schedule. I was a junior in college at the time. Obviously, they didn't give it to him because they knew all of the weird things he'd been doing. I had to skip one of my classes the next day to make my schedule for the next semester. When I got home, my friend told me that Andrew had gone to that very same class. Nobody had given my schedule or told him anything. He had gone onto the website where we make schedules and looked up every single class related to the major I was taking, then went to the classroom where he found my name to basically force me into talking to him. I'd never been so grateful to have skipped a class before in my life. Even after that, he still kept trying to talk to me and kept popping up everywhere as well. Eventually, I did block him on everything, and after that, I finally stopped seeing him around. It really scared me though. I'm glad that eventually it just stopped all on its own. When I was a teen, 14 and female, I used to go running next to a swamp, only a 15-minute walk away or so from my house. To get there though, I had to walk through this short tunnel underneath a railroad track at the bottom of a slope. Although the tunnel was pretty small, there was a lot of echo in that space. As a child, I'd always sing something when walking through it, listening to my own voice bouncing back at me. The place was very isolated, but not particularly creepy most times. Well, not to me at least. That day, I was walking toward the tunnel to go for my usual run when I saw a man walking up the slope. I'd say he looked to be about 50 years old, with grizzled hair and loose clothes. There wasn't anyone else around. What immediately stuck out to me was that he was not doing anything. Nothing at all, really. He was just kind of standing there, swaying on his feet. At some point, I think I heard him talking indistinctly to himself, unless my memory is playing tricks on me. Well, I tried to ignore him. As I walked past him though, he said, "Hello." I mumbled a hello back. Stranger danger, I know, but I was impressionable and overly polite for a 14-year-old. I started heading down the slope, feeling slightly uneased with that encounter, but not particularly scared. I had walked this path countless times before without any trouble. For some reason, the man's polite manners reassured me a little. Still, I was looking forward to being away from someone else out there at night. I reached the tunnel still walking, and my footsteps echoed their familiar rhythm. When I reached the middle of the tunnel, though, I began to hear another echo, much, much faster. Someone was running right at me. I turned around immediately, and there the man was, only a meter behind me. He stopped in his tracks, like some sort of statue. I don't know where I found the courage, but I stared the man in the eye and let him know that I had seen him. I don't know if it was my youth or running gear that let him know I was undoubtedly faster than him. Perhaps it was the fact that he had lost the element of surprise. I saw in his eyes immediately that he had just given up on whatever he was planning to do to me. I hurried away, not looking back at all, and took a different way home. I never told my parents about this, out of fear they wouldn't ever let me outside on my own again. I also avoided that tunnel for a few weeks after. When I finally came back, he wasn't there, and I never saw him again ever since. Back in 2007, shortly after my 15th birthday, my mom was out of town for a few days on a business trip. My mom and I lived alone in a small house, in a neighborhood that was on the sketchier end of decent. That fact, combined with her paranoia about me being home longer than 4 or 5 hours, meant that I had to stay over at a friend's house while she was gone. Thankfully, this friend's house was just across the street and one house over from my own. The place my mom was going was only about 2 hours away. I'd gotten a big bug up my ass about being treated like the young woman that everyone kept calling me, so for the week leading up to the trip, I was moaning and groaning about being old enough to take care of myself. I insisted that I could simply check in with my friend's parents every now and then. In truth, my house was pretty creepy at night, even when my mom was there with me. I'd found out the day my mom was scheduled to leave that my friend had somehow gotten her hands on a PlayStation 3, so it really didn't take me very long to get over being unfairly babysat. At around 11 on the last night I was there, we ended up back in my friend's room screwing around with the brand new flip phone I had gotten for my birthday. Her parents had gone out hours earlier, after buying us a pizza for dinner, and probably weren't going to be back for at least an hour. We'd gotten quite bored downstairs with her one PS3 game that we'd been playing for days already. Turns out she did have a PlayStation, but didn't have any money to actually buy games for it. I guess that's how it usually goes though when you're a kid, huh? It was too late to call any of our friends over, but I knew my mom was coming home tomorrow morning at some ungodly hour. I knew that she had this thing about our answering machine as well. No matter how tired she was, no matter where she'd gotten back from, if there were any messages on the machine, she'd listen to all of them. Being the bored 15-year-olds we were, my friend and I decided to leave a message or two for my mom to find in the morning. We called my home phone and put it on speaker, cracking up and trying to figure out what our message was going to be about. It normally took about 5 rings for a call to go to the machine, but on the 3rd ring, the phone was picked up. Hello. The voice sounded like it belonged to some 60-year-old guy who had been smoking for the last 40 years of his life, but even past that, there was this menace to his voice. I can't quite describe it exactly, but it sounded cold and dangerous. The sort of voice where if you heard it out in the street, you'd know to stay away from that person immediately. I looked over at my friend in surprise. Her eyes were huge and her face was completely pale. I'm sure I didn't look any better. Neither of us could get it together to say anything in response. "Hello?" he said again. There was a brief pause, and I tried to squeak something out along the lines of, "Who the hell are you, and why are you in my house?" The man leaned into the phone and said with a very low voice, "You shouldn't have called." There was some sort of slam, and the call disconnected. I immediately dropped my phone and proceeded to freak the fuck out, as did my friend as well. She asked me if I knew who that was, and I said no. Of course I didn't know this creepy-ass guy answering my home phone at 11 at night. We checked the call log to see if we'd accidentally called the wrong number, but no, it was the right one. We were so shaken up that we couldn't immediately figure out who we should call or what we should do. If we should call the cops, or call my mom, or call my friend's parents, or run around making sure all the doors and windows were locked. We ended up sprinting around my friend's house, double-checking every lock we could check, while gasping out what happened to my friend's parents on the phone. They were about 15 minutes away and said they'd call 911. Her mother told us to stay in my friend's room with the door locked and all the lights on, just in case this guy was going from house to house. For 10 minutes, we were huddled in the far corner of my friend's room, basically under her bed, jumping every time the house settled or one of our legs scraped the carpet. Needless to say, you can imagine how freaked out we were when her parents rushed in and started rattling at our bedroom door, forgetting it had been locked on their orders. The cops got to my house not too long after her parents got home. To be honest, I don't really remember a lot of the specifics about what the cops were doing, mainly because I refused to set foot outside of the house. I remembered that they asked my friend and I a lot of questions, though. Unfortunately, we couldn't really give them a lot of information. We called from my friend's room, which was in the back of her house, away from where we would have been able to see the guy. And of course, dude with a creepy smoker's voice is not exactly a very helpful description to go off of when looking for someone. One question they asked sticks out though, because I remember thinking it was weird for them to ask who had the keys to get into the house. I told them only my mom and I did. I found out later the reason the police had asked was because there were no signs of forced entry anywhere around the house, and the front door was wide open when they got there. There wasn't really anything messed up and nothing was taken either, but our wall-mounted corded phone was hanging off the hook and the phone base itself was cracked, like it had been smashed with something. Both my mom's room and my room had some stuff moved around and displaced, like someone was going through all our drawers in our rooms specifically. My mom got called at some point during all of this and managed to get home that night, very tired and freaked out at what had happened. The cops investigated the incident, but never came up with any answers. We weren't doing too well financially at that point, but we still managed to move across town within a few months of this happening. For the months between that night and the day we moved, though, I slept like shit and had real bad nightmares. I also flat out refused to be alone from then on, even for only a couple of minutes. I got really obsessive about checking and double-checking the locks, a habit which has stuck around since this happened. Now that I've written this all out, I remember there's one more thing I haven't told anyone about all of this. Mostly because at the time I thought the whole thing might get blamed on me if I said anything. Earlier that day, I'd gone back over to my house to get a notebook of mine, full of writing I wanted to show my friend. Nothing was obviously wrong as far as I could tell. The front door was locked when I got to it, and no signs of any tampering or weirdness by the door. No noises from any part of the house either. But the minute I stepped inside, something just felt wrong. It was really, really quiet. I was getting chills all up and down my spine and had goosebumps all over. I tried to will myself to just get over it, to go back to my room and grab the notebook, but I couldn't make myself take more than a few steps inside. I was too creeped out. I locked the door behind me and ran back across the street. When I got back to my friend's house, I felt like an idiot, of course. Was I really such a wimp that I couldn't walk through my own house when it was empty? But looking back, well, who knows? Maybe my gut was right about something not being right. Freaks me out even thinking about what could have happened if I'd ignored it and walked further inside. I've thought back on that moment a lot, wondering if perhaps I left the door open when I left, but there's no way. I distinctly remember locking the deadbolt and looking over my shoulders the entire time. I had that burning, crawling feeling on the back of my neck that you get when you're being watched. After the creepy call, I also checked, and I had my keys in my backpack still as well. This happened years ago, when I was about 13 or 14. When I was a young teenager back in the fall of 2006, me, my family, and my neighbors started having bizarre encounters with an old man in a dark red minivan. Back then, I used to live on a hill above an old non-operational fishing village. It was about a 40-minute drive outside of the city along a highway. The highway to the village was a dead end. There was nothing down that way, except for some housing. There weren't even motels or any stores even. Most of the houses were homes to elderly people, while the others were abandoned fishing stages that overlooked the water. Needless to say, it was very strange to see anyone you didn't recognize down in that area, especially from September till May. We would get the odd tourists during the summer months, but never from fall to spring. When I was in middle school, every day after I got home off the bus, I would walk up to the mailbox. It was a good 15-minute walk along the highway. The mailbox was up the road towards the city. Past my house, there were only about 8 other houses, all on the same side of the road as mine. After those other houses, it was all just thick trees and marshes. I used to like to call the area Silentville, because it gave off a Silent Hill sort of vibe. We were right on the very edge of the East Coast, you see, right by the ocean, so there was an eerie fog bank all year around. It was in fact very rare we would get any sunny days. Even when it was sunny in the city, it was still foggy down there. Sometimes the fog was so thick you could barely even see a few feet ahead of you. Anyway, one afternoon after school, while I was on my usual trek back home after checking the mailbox, I heard the rattling of a vehicle off in the distance in the fog. I always walked facing traffic, since my mother would have a fit if I did not. Safety rules and all that. It was crawling towards me, headlights now clearing the fog. It was probably going about 5 miles per hour, which was odd considering the speed limit here was about 70. The minivan came to a halt about 10 feet ahead of me. Just stopped there, right in the middle of the highway. I continued walking towards it, figuring it was someone lost in the fog looking for directions. As I neared the window of the car, I could see an old man sitting in the driver's seat. He was of a fairly small build, with light gray patches of hair on his head. His eyes were very watery, and a dull blue color as well. "Hello, young lady," he said in a very soft voice. I responded by saying hi, and he started making small chat with me. I can't really remember what, but just sort of casual talking. I noticed he had a small fluffy white dog in his passenger seat as well. The thing that struck me as odd about this dog was its body language. You see, this old man would move his hands a lot while talking, and every time he would quickly do so, the dog would sort of scrunch further back in its seat. It seemed to be very afraid of him. The other odd thing was that he'd always kept his other hand between the 2 seats. I could sort of make out what seemed to be something of a metallic make under his hand. Well, after chatting for a moment, he just slowly turned his head away and then continued on driving toward the city. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe he was a relative of someone down in the village and on his way home. About a week went by without seeing him, and by then he was just a memory. I was on my way up to the mailbox when I heard the familiar sound of rattling coming down the road towards me. Him again? I thought. I was more than a little weirded out now, so I jumped down into the ditch and hid in the brush. I watched as he sluggishly drove by, the entire time looking around, observing, kind of like a hunter looking for prey. After he was long out of sight and I couldn't hear the vehicle anymore, I jumped up from the ditch and hurried my way up to the mailbox. The last 6-minute stretch of the road had no housing, so it was very isolated. After snatching up the mail, I started to hurry back, and that's when I ran into him again, in the worst place possible, the long stretch with no houses. This time he was coming up the road quite fast. I didn't have any time to hide. He pulled up right next to me. "Hello, dearie. Why were you down in the ditch earlier?" Oh shit, I thought. He had seen me. I thought I had seen a cat down there," I said. "Oh, you like cute animals, dearie? You can get in the back seat and play with my puppy if you'd like. She loves kids." He leaned in and gave me the creepiest smile. No thanks, I said. I started to walk away very quickly. He reached out of his window, though, and grabbed my arm.
Please, I insist. I can drive you home. You live at my address, right?
I stood there dumbfounded. How did he know which house I lived in? I shook off his hand and started to run. He started to back up his car after me. I bolted down the road and did not look back once. At that time, my aunt lived a few houses up the road from my own, so I ran into her driveway and started frantically pounding on her door. She came very quickly and let me inside. I used her phone and called my mother to come pick me up. After we got home, I told them everything. They were very upset and called the police. Basically, they told us they couldn't do anything, especially since I didn't have the license plate number. After that, I was not allowed to go on walks anymore, but he continued to show up. Usually twice a week, right after my school bus dropped me off, he would appear, slowly riding down the road. One day, my neighbor asked him what he was doing.
Oh, I'm just a lonely gentleman. I saw a woman one day down the road working on her garden, and she just captured my heart.
My neighbor told him she was married. He just laughed it off and said something like, "If you want love to work, you have to work for it." Then he drove off. My neighbor got the license plate and called the police. About 40 minutes later, they came down, but he was long gone by then. My neighbor waved the police over and talked to them. They told him that car had been reported stolen a few months back. Sometime during November, my parents were out in the evening doing yard work. He stopped in front of our yard and was asking my parents where I was. He said he missed our time together and felt neglected. My parents got really upset and chased him away. A few days later, I was up late at night playing Final Fantasy on the Xbox 360 in the den. The den was on the bottom floor. I used to keep all the blinds open with the lights off in the room. I liked to look out at the night sky. Probably people could see me through the window, since it was facing the street. So there I was, illuminated by the TV, all curled up in my big armchair having a late-night game session, when I see that familiar red minivan coming out of the fog down the road. I froze. It parked a few feet up the road from my property, in between our house and the house next door. There was a small driveway that led to nowhere, going in between our land. He stopped his car, turned it off, and then came out. I watched in horror as he walked closer to our house. I was terrified. I pushed myself as far back into the chair as I could, hoping he would not see me. I felt like screaming, but my parents were upstairs and they were both sound sleepers. He paced back and forth in front of our house, staring into the window. He was just looking into the den. Now, this is the extremely strange part. He suddenly stopped in place, then laid down on the side of the road in front of our house. He just laid there for a good hour. I was frozen with fear the entire time. After an hour had passed, he got up, then strolled back to his car and left. I ran upstairs crying and told my parents. They called the police again, but of course he was gone by the time they got there. We were all frustrated. The police, despite having his plate, could not do anything. This guy was coming around, harassing and terrifying us and our neighbors now too. This went on until about March. About a month passed by without seeing him, and that's when I got the news. Our neighbor, who was good friends with someone that lived down a dead-end side road up a bit further, had been on a walk to his friend's house. He spotted the red minivan off in a driveway of a house that had been put up for sale. He got filled with anger when seeing it and ran over. When he got closer, though, he noticed blood on the passenger side window. He went to the closest house and used their phone to call 911. He went back over to the car to check it out. The man was pretty ballsy, sort of a neighborhood protector type. The car doors were all unlocked. He looked into the window, only to see that small dog's body, a wallet which had an ID in it, and a bloody wrench wedged in between two seats. He left and waited for the police to arrive. Our neighbor stayed in contact with the police. Apparently, the guy had left in a hurry, leaving his ID behind. Turns out he had just been released from prison not too long ago for offenses toward minors. We didn't get any more details, though. I felt so horrible for that dog. I really hope he never got his hands on another animal again. Sometimes I worry he went on to harass other people the very same way he harassed us. I'm 22 years old, and this incident happened a year and a half ago. I had just moved into my first apartment and was in the process of still moving in. The door that led to my apartment locked itself automatically when closed. I was going to the entrance of the apartment complex to get my mail while talking on the phone with my boyfriend. I returned to my apartment and sat down on the bed while opening the mail and using the phone. I dropped the phone on the floor though, and it landed underneath my bed. I had to lie down on the floor and stretch out for it, but as I did so, I caught something in the corner of my eye. There seemed to be something unusual under my bed. A person. My eyes widened, and I choked the urge to scream. The person under my bed was lying still, with his back towards me and his head to his chest. I couldn't see any of his features. He didn't see me either, it seemed. Trying to be rational and quiet while so many thoughts rushed through my head, I picked up the phone. Babe? Sorry I dropped my phone. I'm gonna take a shower real quick and call you back. The bathroom was right by my bed, so I hastily walked inside, locked the door, turned the shower on, and jumped out my window. Then I called the police. They told me to wait nearby, go across the street, and see if anyone comes out the door to the apartment complex. This was during summer, so it was still light out. I placed myself across the street, hiding behind a car whilst watching my open bathroom window and the entryway door. I called my boyfriend. He came to me just before the police. I gave them my keys and they went inside. Only moments later, 2 cops came out holding a thin and tired-looking man. His eyes looked insane, but he didn't try to get away. The policeman that stood beside me and comforted me while the police searched through my house told me the man had been standing outside my bathroom door with one of my kitchen knives, waiting for me to come out. This man had somehow crept in my entry door while I was getting my mail and hid underneath my bed for me. The man that was trying to hurt me turned out to be a homeless person and was placed in a mental hospital soon after. My boyfriend moved in with me the very next day.